Ben Harding didn't hear the phone the first time it rang. He was at the kitchen table, half listening to Eli chatter about dinosaurs while grading a stack of sophomore essays on the American Revolution. Outside, the wind stirred the early evening light through bare branches, casting soft, shifting shadows across the floor. It was an ordinary Thursday. Ben was home taking care of his son, wishing his wife Rachel were here with takeout from the Thai place she liked. She was driving out to a weekend retreat, some kind of art therapy thing she'd agreed to at the last minute. She hadn't even wanted to go at first. Ben had told her she should. The phone rang again. He reached for it absently, a red pen still in his other hand. The screen showed an unknown number, local. He almost let it go to voicemail. Hello? Is this Mr. Benjamin Harding? Yes. This is Officer Reed with the County Sheriff's Department. Sir, I'm calling about your wife, Rachel Harding. There's been an accident. Ben didn't breathe. The pen fell from his hand, hitting the floor with a dull tap. The next hour blurred into colors and noise. Eli in the back seat, buckled in and confused, asking where Mommy was and why Daddy wasn't talking. The emergency room waiting area smelled of antiseptic and old coffee. Behind the desk, a woman told him someone would come speak to him soon. He hadn't even thought to call anyone. Not his mother or Rachel's sister, not the babysitter. His fingers had gone numb. Are you here for Rachel Harding? A voice asked, and he looked up. A nurse stood in front of him, soft-faced, gentle-voiced. She motioned for him to follow her, and he did, only half aware that someone else had risen from across the room at the same time. A woman. She looked about his age, maybe younger, her expression vacant but composed. They both stopped when they reached the same hallway. Sorry, Ben said awkwardly. I think. The nurse looked between them. You're here for Rachel Harding, she said to Ben. Then to the woman, and you're Julia Reynolds? The woman gave a slight nod. The nurse's face softened even more. I'm so sorry. You should both come with me. The crash had involved two vehicles. Rachel's compact sedan, Mark Reynolds' SUV, one headed west, the other east. The cause wasn't entirely clear. Something about icy roads, sudden overcorrection. The investigators' report would take days. Neither driver had survived. Rachel had been wearing her seatbelt. The nurse said it like it was supposed to help. Ben didn't cry until he saw her. They let him sit with her for a while. Eli was asleep in a chair down the hall, one of the nurses watching him. Rachel looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Like a wax figure of the woman he'd kissed goodbye that morning while she adjusted her scarf and made him promise to eat a real lunch. He sat there, numb and aching, and wondered if she had suffered. If she had thought of him. If she had known it was the end. He didn't remember leaving the room. Didn't remember taking Eli home or putting him to bed, though later he'd find a peanut butter sandwich half made on the counter and realize he must have tried. The next clear thing in his mind was standing in the kitchen hours later, staring out the window at the dark yard, Rachel's favorite mug still sitting in the sink. The funeral home called the next morning. There were decisions to make, urgent, clinical things like burial versus cremation, dates and locations, and costs. He barely made it through the conversation. Later that day, Ben sat in the waiting area at the city records office to pick up Rachel's death certificate. He hadn't even known where to go until the nurse handed him a printout of the next steps. That was where he saw her again. Julia Reynolds sat alone holding a clipboard, her dark coat still dusted with snow. Her eyes met his, and for a moment they just looked at each other. No polite smile, no words. Just the stunned recognition of two people whose lives had ended on the same stretch of road. After a long pause, she offered a faint nod. Ben returned it because it felt like the only thing to do. Ben didn't know her, had never met her husband, but somehow, sitting across the room from her as clerks processed paperwork and fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, he felt less alone. And maybe, he thought, that was something. Julia had slept little. She'd gone home from the hospital with a manila envelope of pamphlets and a plastic bag containing Mark's watch, phone, and wallet. She hadn't opened it, just left it on the counter next to the uneaten bananas and the mail Mark never sorted. The city office was painfully bright. Julia sat with her coat still on, fingers pressed around a clipboard with a checklist titled Next of Kin Responsibilities. There were 13 items. She'd read it 5 times and couldn't remember a single one. She noticed him again before she heard him. Ben Harding, she'd remembered. His wife was the other driver, Rachel. He looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. His eyes dark, shoulders slightly hunched, like he was carrying something heavy that didn't show. They sat across from each other in silence. Grief wasn't a language you could share. Not yet. "Reynolds?" a clerk called. Julia rose and walked to the window, feeling Ben's eyes follow her. When she sat back down, her hands were trembling. She glanced up at him again, almost expecting him to look away. He didn't. Eli was home with Cal, one of Ben's oldest friends, who had dropped everything to come over and play board games while Ben handled the logistics, as Cal had gently put it. There was something coldly surreal about standing in line for a death certificate, like it was a car registration. He'd brought a folder because it felt like something Rachel would have done. Rachel was always like that. Neat, prepared, always a step ahead. Julia Reynolds looked like she hadn't slept either. She wasn't crying, just still. Grief looked different on everyone, he guessed. He recognized the dazed composure. It was the same mask he saw in the mirror. When her name was called, she moved like she wasn't quite in her body. Ben's name came next. At the window, he signed forms and answered questions he didn't fully understand. Did he want multiple copies? Was Rachel an organ donor? Did he have someone helping with arrangements? My friends are helping. It sounded flimsy as it left his mouth. The clerk nodded like she'd heard that a dozen times this week. She passed him a stapled packet with information about funeral homes. As he turned to leave, he glanced back. Julia hadn't moved. Julia saw him pause in the doorway. Something in her wanted to speak, to say I'm sorry or I know, but the words caught in her throat. They felt too thin. Outside, the wind had picked up. She pulled her coat tighter and exited just behind him. On the sidewalk, they both hesitated. "Rachel," she whispered, her voice cracking on the name. "That was your wife?" He turned to her, eyes softening. "Yeah, Mark, your husband?" Julia nodded. They lingered, two strangers with shattered worlds, unsure if it was polite to keep talking. But neither turned to go. "They said it was the road," Julia offered. "Ice, maybe." He nodded. "That stretch is brutal in winter." For a long, aching moment, they lapsed into silence, neither knowing what to say. "I don't know why I'm here," Julie admitted. "It all feels fake, like I'm helping someone else plan a funeral." "I know the feeling," Ben said. "Feels like I'm filling out paperwork for a ghost." It wasn't funny, but she laughed. So did he, just barely. "I should get back," he said, motioning vaguely down the street. "My son's 7. I left him with a friend." "Oh," she said softly. "I didn't realize you had a child." "Yeah, Eli, he doesn't understand yet. Not fully." Julia swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." "Me too." They parted without exchanging numbers or last names. But as Julia watched him walk away, she realized something strange. For the first time in days, she didn't feel alone. The house was quiet, but not in the peaceful way Ben used to love. It was the kind of quiet that pressed in from all sides. The kind that made every creak sound like a scream. Rachel had always filled the house, not just with her voice, but her presence. Now everything felt off-kilter. Eli barely spoke. When he did, it was only to ask impossible questions like, "Is Mommy still wearing her glasses in heaven?" Or, "Can she see us from up there?" Ben didn't know how to answer. He just said, "Maybe," and kissed the top of his son's head. On Sunday morning, he found himself parked outside the cafe Rachel used to love. Ben wasn't even sure why he stopped. He hadn't meant to get out of the car. That was when he saw her again. Julia, sitting by the window, a coffee untouched in front of her, her eyes fixed on something far beyond the glass. For a moment, he thought of leaving. But when she looked up and saw him, she offered the faintest wave. He took it as permission. They sat in silence for a minute before she spoke. "I didn't think I'd run into anyone I recognized." Ben nodded. "I wasn't even planning to stop." "Me neither." He didn't ask what she was thinking. He just sat, warming his hands on the paper cup. "Mark hated this place," she added, then gave a weak smile. Said the coffee was overpriced and the chairs were too artsy. Ben offered a soft huff of laughter. Rachel used to love it, said the mismatched chairs gave it character. Another pause ensued, but this one felt easier. I'm sorry about your son, Julia said gently. 7, right? Yeah, Eli. He's quiet. Keeps waiting for someone to tell him it's a prank or something. She nodded slowly. I don't have kids. We talked about it, but it never happened. Ben heard the rest of that sentence in her voice. And now it never will. They sat there until both cups had gone cold. When they parted, Ben surprised himself by saying, if you ever need help with the logistics, paperwork, contacts, I've got a list I've been using. She hesitated, then said, could we trade? I've got one too. They exchanged numbers. It was clinical, almost detached, and there was no intent behind the gesture except to provide mutual support in a difficult time. It was just something human to hold on to. Julia hadn't planned to call him, but 3 hours later she found herself sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by forms she didn't understand, and staring at a post-it note with the words Ben followed by a phone number. She dialed. Ben picked up on the second ring. Hey. Hi, sorry, there's this form, and I don't know if I'm supposed to fill out Section B or if that's only for next of kin when there's no will. Ben was quiet for a second, then said, I just did that one yesterday. It's Section A unless there's no estate. Thank God, she said, letting her head fall back against the couch. I thought I was losing my mind. You're not. This stuff's just cruel. They ended up talking for an hour about paperwork, about cremation versus burial, about how people kept offering casseroles like grief could be solved with side dishes. I had 3 lasagnas delivered yesterday, Julia said. I don't even like lasagna. Ben laughed, and the sound made something loosen in her chest. Can I ask something? She said. Sure. Why did you come over to my table today? Ben paused. Because you look like I felt. Julia didn't cry while they talked, but after they hung up, she did. A few days later, Julia texted, do you have someone doing your programs? I have a template from a coworker if you want. He did want, not because of the template, because it gave them a reason to meet. They sat on his porch while Eli played with sidewalk chalk. Julia handed over a folder with sample layouts and offered a few suggestions. She was calm, organized, and steady. The kind of presence Ben didn't realize he'd been missing until he felt it again. Eli came over and looked up at her curiously. Miss Julia, are you the one who gave Daddy that list with the funny pictures? Julia blinked, then smiled. The one with the flowers on it? Yep, that was me. I like the flowers, Eli said. Then in the way kids do, he darted away again. Ben glanced at her. He likes you. I'm glad, she said, voice soft. By the time she left, they still hadn't talked about the funerals, but it felt inevitable that they would. They'd begun to inhabit each other's grief, not just as witnesses, but as anchors. Ben didn't know what he was expecting from Mark Reynolds' funeral, but it wasn't the thick sense of distance that hung over the pews. It was quiet, respectful, orderly, everything Rachel's funeral wouldn't be. The pastor gave a polished eulogy, prepared by someone who knew Mark professionally, but not personally. There were polite tears, discreet sniffles, and a slideshow that seemed to say, here was a man who had accomplished a great deal, but little about who he was behind the tie and title. Ben sat near the back with Eli. He'd debated bringing his son, but Eli had insisted. Julia's going to be sad, he'd said. We should go. Ben hadn't corrected him. Maybe Eli was right. He just nodded and put on a blazer that still smelled of Rachel's perfume from the last time she hugged him wearing it. He saw Julia only once. She was in the front row, flanked by Mark's parents, her profile still and unreadable. Julia didn't speak during the service. She didn't move much at all. They left afterward. No goodbyes, just a quiet walk to the car, Eli's hand in his. Rachel's funeral was different, louder, messier, more real. People cried without shame. Some laughed at stories that felt too ridiculous to tell in a church, but Rachel would have wanted them told anyway. About her kindergarten art class antics, her obsession with thrift store mugs, and how she once accidentally dyed her hair teal and kept it that way for a month because her students loved it. Ben stood by Eli as people passed them in a blur. Neighbors, co-workers, parents of her students. He didn't register most of it, only the moments Eli's small hand tightened around his, grounding him. Near the end, he noticed her, Julia, slipping in late, sitting near the back. She didn't come over afterward, though he'd half hoped she would. Instead, she left something on the sign-in table. Ben saw it after most of the guests had gone. It was a bouquet of soft, white ranunculus and eucalyptus, arranged simply, but with care. Tucked into the stems was a card, one line, in looping script. She mattered, even to those who never knew her. Ben stood in the empty reception hall with the card in his hand and felt the knot in his chest come loose just enough to let grief flood through. That night, after Eli had gone to bed, he read the card again and didn't stop the tears this time. Julia hadn't intended to attend Rachel's funeral. It felt intrusive. She didn't know the woman, hadn't even seen a photo until the obituary. But when the day came, her feet took her there anyway. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe she just couldn't stay away. She sat near the back, heart clenched as people spoke about a woman whose absence seemed to echo louder than her presence had. There was color and laughter in the stories, a palpable ache in every shared memory. Julia grieved not just Mark, but the marriage she hadn't had, and the love that was now irretrievably gone. Julia left before the reception. She wasn't ready for small talk or sideways glances, but she left the bouquet. It felt important. A few days later, she heard the knock on her door. Ben stood on the porch holding a manila envelope. "You left this at the funeral," he said, holding out a misdelivered insurance form. "I thought you might need it." She stepped aside and let him in. They ended up in the kitchen, leaning against opposite counters with tea neither of them drank. "Are you okay?" He shook his head. "No, me neither," she whispered. He looked around her kitchen, still, quiet, untouched, like absence had made itself at home. "Mornings are the worst. I still make 2 cups of coffee without thinking." "Mark didn't drink coffee," she whispered, "but I still reach for his mug." Ben nodded. They didn't talk about love or loss or what any of it meant, but they talked. And when Ben left, something lingered in the air. Not romance, not yet, but a thread, a tether. It started with grocery lists. Ben had mentioned struggling to cook things Eli would eat. Julia texted her go-to recipe for morning wheat pasta, a 4-ingredient dish she'd made 3 nights in a row. He'd responded with a picture of a half-burned attempt and the caption, "Eli says I tried my best. I think he's being generous." The text became daily, short, often funny, sometimes just emojis. When she dropped off a printed worksheet for a burial benefits claim Ben had missed, he invited her to stay for dinner. Not because it was special, but because he was tired of eating with the television. That dinner turned into 2 more. Then Julia found herself at the hardware store helping him pick a new light fixture for the kitchen, because Rachel had always hated the buzzing one, and he couldn't bear to see it flicker anymore. They weren't dating. They weren't even exactly grieving together anymore. They were orbiting, near, but not colliding. One night, Julia brought over muffins. Eli opened the door before Ben could. "Miss Julia, Daddy said you might come." She smiled. "Did he?" Eli nodded solemnly. "He said you make things quieter, but in a good way." Her heart squeezed, and she looked up to see Ben standing behind him, having heard the whole thing. "I told him that in confidence," he said dryly, but there was no heat in it, just quiet affection. Then he stepped aside to let her in. Julia hadn't planned to walk to Ben's house that night. Mark's parents were still in town, and the house felt like a play she'd been dropped into mid-performance without a script. His mother refolding laundry Julia had already folded, his father pacing the hallway with a glass of something amber and judgmental. Julia didn't belong there. Maybe she never had. She walked to clear her head, coat zipped tight, and feet moving on instinct through silent streets, carrying a heart that was quieter still. When she came to his door, she paused as if uncertain of her welcome. Then Ben opened the door before she could knock. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. "No," she said. "Can I?" "Yeah," he said, stepping aside. Eli was asleep on the couch, sprawled across mismatched pillows, a half-finished drawing still clutched in one hand. Julia offered a faint smile and followed Ben into the kitchen. They didn't talk for a while. Julia traced the rim of her mug, watching the steam swirl. Then she said, quiet and uncertain, "What if I'm not grieving Mark?" "Not really, just the space where he should have been." Ben didn't flinch. "That's still grief." She nodded. "Everyone wants me to wear black and whisper and be sad. But what I feel is relief and guilt, and then guilt for feeling relief." He said nothing, but the way he looked at her made her feel understood. "Sometimes it's easier being around you than anyone else," she said before she could stop herself. He didn't answer at first. Then he said it. "Me too." Silence fell between them, heavy and tender and fragile. Julia looked up and their eyes held. Ben reached forward, not enough to cross the line, just enough to acknowledge it was there. Julia leaned forward, her breath hitching, inches apart, knowing it would take only a small motion to complete the kiss. Then it ended before it became anything. Ben's eyebrows crinkled. Julia blinked, and they sighed as one. Julia's eyes welled. "I can't." "I know," Ben said, not moving. "It's okay. I shouldn't be here. You're not doing anything wrong." She stepped back. "I know, but I still need to go." This time she didn't walk away. She ran. Julia was gone before the door had even clicked shut. Ben stood in the quiet, the kitchen still holding the warmth of her presence, like steam rising from a mug left behind. Then he followed her outside, hoping to catch sight of her retreating form. But she was gone. He sat on the porch steps and buried his face in his hands. Ben didn't know what scared him more, that he'd almost kissed someone so soon, or that he'd wanted to. Rachel wasn't fading. Ben still heard her humming in the laundry room, still caught himself reaching for his phone to text her something funny Eli had said. At night, he still reached for her in their bed, only to shed fresh tears when he realized she was not there, would never be there again. But Julia was becoming part of his rhythm, like breath returning after holding it too long. The next day, Ben didn't text, and Julia didn't either. The quiet came back, and it settled heavier than before. Ben's friends came over 2 nights later, bearing beer and sympathy disguised as a guy's night. Cal dominated the conversation with tales of dating disasters. Liam talked about finishing the deck his ex-wife had demanded, then abandoned. Drew just watched Ben until the others stepped out to talk. "Are you okay?" Drew asked. Ben gave a half shrug. "Trying. You've been off the past few days." Ben paused. "I got close to something I wasn't ready for." Drew nodded. "Then back off, but don't shut it out." "What if I hurt her?" Drew didn't hesitate. "What if you don't?" Ben didn't answer, not because he didn't have one, because he had too many. Time didn't heal. It just moved. Ben went back to work part-time in early March, stepping into his classroom with a forced smile and a new stack of grief-shaped boundaries. Colleagues gave him gentle looks. Some students tried too hard. Others avoided his gaze. Eli returned to school the same week and came home each day a little quieter, a little older. Julia didn't text. Ben didn't either. She had done nothing wrong and neither had he, but the moment between them, the breathless, almost kiss, had left something raw and trembling inside him. Ben told himself they needed space, that grief had blurred the lines between them. But each day without her, the quiet grew louder. His friends noticed. Cal invited him out more. Liam tried to set him up with someone. Ben didn't even answer the message. Drew stopped asking questions, but showed up with takeout more often than usual. They all pitched in to help with Eli when Ben was paralyzed from grief. In April, Eli asked, "Is Miss Julia on a trip or something?" Ben didn't know what to say. "No, bud. She's just not around right now." Eli frowned. "I liked when she was." Ben did too. The mornings were worst. Julia's body had adjusted to waking alone, but the loneliness had grown teeth. Mark's parents had returned home, leaving the house blessedly empty. Her sister visited a few times, always trying to prod her forward, into dating apps, into yoga, into new beginnings. But Julia didn't want a new beginning. She wanted clarity. She kept thinking about that moment in Ben's kitchen, how close they had been, how she had wanted to kiss him, how she had almost done it, and how terrifying that had been. Julia threw herself into work, took on too many clients, and said yes to every last-minute booking. She didn't want time to think, but late at night when the world stilled, she thought anyway. Had she imagined the connection? Had she hurt him by pulling away? She almost texted him once, had the message typed out. How are you doing? Just that. Nothing more. She deleted it. May brought tulips and rain. The anniversary of his and Rachel's engagement came and went. He didn't mention it to anyone, but he took the day off and took Eli to the zoo. Rachel had loved the penguins. It rained halfway through, soaking them both. Eli didn't mind. Mom would have said it made it more fun, he'd laughed, his hair plastered to his forehead. Ben had smiled and held his hand tighter. The next weekend, they were out grocery shopping when Eli tugged at his sleeve. Daddy, look. Julia was standing in the produce aisle holding a bag of apples, her back half turned. Ben's breath caught. Julia turned as if she had felt them before she saw them. Eli darted forward before either adult could say anything. Miss Julia! She knelt, arms open, and he barreled into her. She hugged him, eyes squeezed shut. Ben approached more slowly. Hi, she said when she looked up. Hi. Neither knew what to say after that. I was just picking up some fruit, she offered, holding up the bag. Ben nodded. We're out of cereal. Eli eats like he's training for something. I'm growing, Eli declared proudly. There was a beat of silence. Then Julia said, Do you have a few minutes? Ben looked down at Eli. You okay to sit in the little cafe with your book? Eli nodded, already pulling it out of the grocery bag. They sat at a corner table by the window. I didn't know if I'd ever see you again, she said. I wasn't sure you wanted to. The question was whether I deserved it. Ben looked at her for a long moment. I missed you, he said. Her eyes filled, but she blinked the tears back. I missed you too. They didn't call it forgiveness. They didn't talk about what came next. But they sat there long enough that the coffee went cold, and Eli eventually came over and asked if they could get chocolate milk on the way home. When she said yes without hesitation, Ben knew they weren't starting over. They were picking up something they'd never put down. Julia found it by accident. It had been 2 weeks since the grocery store, the slow, quiet reconnection with Ben and Eli that felt like sadness softened by something she couldn't name. Julia had been working up the courage to clear out Mark's office. She told herself it was just paperwork, that it was practical, necessary. But the moment she touched the brass handle, her hand had trembled. The first few drawers were what she expected. Old receipts, product samples, business cards from people she barely remembered. The third drawer, tucked beneath a file of invoices, held a leather-bound planner she'd never seen before. She almost didn't open it. Inside were notes, not just appointments, but thoughts, brief ones, some business-related, some not. On a Tuesday 3 weeks before the crash, he'd written, Think about the anniversary trip. It could be good for us. Julia deserves that. Further down the page, a note in smaller handwriting. Look up that resort she liked near the lake. Send an inquiry next week. No confirmation email, no official booking. Just a plan he never made real. Just the intention. She sat down on the carpet, planner in her lap, the edges digging into her palms. He had noticed. All that time she thought he was fine with the silence, with their disconnection. He'd been thinking about a way back to her. He just never said it, never acted in time. And now there was no more time at all. Her tears came slow and quiet. Not sobs, just a steady stream of all the things she never got to ask. All the things she thought she'd accepted. She didn't even notice herself texting Ben until she saw the red notification flash back. He came over after Eli was in bed, Drew staying there with him like a silent guardian. Julia had written, I found something. I don't know what to do with it. She opened the door before he could knock. The house smelled like cedar and dust. The lights were dim, her eyes were puffy, and her sleeves pushed back like she'd forgotten what she was wearing. I'm sorry to just show up in your inbox like that, she said. Don't be. She led him to the living room and held out the planner without a word. He flipped it open, reading the same small words she had. When he looked up, her expression was unreadable. He noticed, she said finally. I thought he didn't. For months I thought we were drifting apart, and he didn't care. But he did. He just never said anything. Ben closed the planner. That doesn't make it your fault. I know, I just wish I could talk to him now, tell him I would have gone, that I would have wanted to try. You did want to try, Ben said gently. You stayed, waited. That means something. Julia folded her arms. I keep thinking I'm finished grieving him. But then something like this pops up and it's like losing him all over again. That's how it works, he said. You don't finish grief. You just learn how to live with it in your pocket. She looked at him then, really looked. And for a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, she said, "You're the only person who doesn't try to fix it. You just sit in it with me." He smiled faintly. Maybe that's what we're both doing, sitting in the mess until it doesn't scare us anymore. There was a pause between them before Julia broke it. Can you stay for a while, she asked. Not to talk, just to not be alone. He nodded. There was still nothing between them, no touches, no kisses. They just sat on the couch side by side, breathing in the same quiet. Somehow the silence between them said everything. And, for now, that was enough. It started small. One morning when he was running late for school drop-off, Julia offered to take Eli with her on her way to a client meeting. Ben hesitated, then said yes. Eli came home with a paper crown from the coffee shop and a drawing labeled "Miss Julia is nice." The next week, she picked him up from school on a day when Ben got stuck grading final essays. Then she came to his school play. Eli had one line and wore a cardboard tree, but afterward, Julia knelt beside him and said, "You were the best part of the forest." Eli beamed like he'd won an Oscar. And so it went. They never discussed roles. She wasn't trying to be Rachel, and Ben wasn't trying to rush anything. But her presence filled the empty spaces like warm light slipping under a door. One Friday, Julia stayed for dinner. Ben's friends were already there. Cal, Liam, and Drew, eating pizza and debating whether anyone under 30 knew how to change a tire. When Julia arrived, they fell silent as if inspecting her. Then Cal handed her a beer and said, "You're the one who saved Ben from the lasagna parade, right?" Julia smiled. Guilty. By the end of the night, Liam was giving her book recommendations. Cal had asked for her muffin recipe, and Drew, quiet as always, just nodded his approval on his way out. Ben knew them. If she'd been anyone else, one of them would have asked for her number. But they didn't. They could already sense what was building between them. After they left, Ben turned to her, eyebrows raised. "I think you passed." Julia laughed. "Were they vetting me?" Drew didn't say a word more than he had to for 3 weeks after Rachel died. "He talked to you tonight. That's practically a standing ovation." Her smile softened. "I like them. They remind me that life goes on." She never expected to feel comfortable in Ben's house. Not really. But one evening, as she sat at his kitchen table folding paper airplanes with Eli, it hit her. The space no longer felt hollow. The pictures on the fridge weren't ghostly reminders. The books on the shelf weren't untouched shrines. It felt like a house someone was living in again. And part of her was living there, too. Later, Ben was drying dishes while she put away leftovers. She didn't mean to speak. It just slipped out. Mark and I stopped talking about little things years before the big things. I didn't even notice until it was quiet all the time. Ben looked over his shoulder. That's a hard quiet. Yeah, I kept telling myself it was normal, that work was stressful, and that marriage settles. But I think we just stopped seeing each other. Ben didn't respond right away. Then he set down the dish towel and leaned against the counter. Rachel and I, we were lucky, he said. It wasn't perfect, but we never stopped checking in, even if it was just stupid stuff. Did you see that bird outside the window? Or did you remember to get bananas? It sounds small, but I miss that more than anything. Julia nodded, throat tight. I think that's what I always wanted. They stood in the quiet, surrounded by echoes. One marriage full and cut short, the other long but hollow. And somehow in the middle of it, they found each other. I'm not trying to replace her, Julia breathed. I know, Ben said, and I'm not trying to forget her. They held each other's gaze. We're not filling spaces, he added. We're choosing something new. Julia reached for his hand, and just like that, it felt like something honest had begun. The first time Ben accompanied Julia to a client party, he wore the wrong shoes. I told you it was business casual, she whispered as they walked into the event hall. I heard casual, he muttered, glancing down at his well-worn loafers. Julia smiled and looped her arm through his. You're lucky I like you. It was a fundraising gala for a local community center, and Julia had planned it top to bottom. Ben stood back and watched her work the room. Graceful, warm, competent. She introduced him to colleagues as Ben, my partner, and the word made something tighten in his chest in the best way. She shone in public in a way Rachel never had, but not brighter, just different. Ben realized, standing among chattering donors and clinking glasses, that he wasn't comparing anymore. He was just with her. 2 weeks later, Julia came to his school's end-of-year barbecue. She brought a tray of roasted veggie skewers and wore a sundress that made the other teachers blink. "That's Julia?" one whispered to Ben. "You didn't tell us she was cool." "She's deeply skeptical of cafeteria nachos," Ben said as they sat down at a picnic table. "I said they were ambitious," Julia countered. "That's a compliment." Eli ran between the picnic tables and the bounce house, sticky-faced and laughing. Every few minutes, he circled back to Julia, as if needing to anchor himself. Ben watched her wipe his cheeks and brush his hair back. She didn't mother him. She met him where he was. And Eli, in return, had begun to call her Jules when he thought no one was listening. Later, as the sun dipped low and the grill smoke faded into golden air, Ben took her hand and said quietly, "You've made every part of my life better." Julia didn't speak. She just squeezed his hand. Now it was summer and the park hummed with life. Ben lay back on the picnic blanket, one hand folded behind his head, the other resting over Julia's knee. Eli was a blur of motion on the monkey bars, his shrieks rising above the din of birds and wind. "You know," Julia said, watching him, "this was never part of the future I imagined." Ben turned toward her. "What did you see?" "A nice apartment, maybe some travel, meeting with clients. Maybe we get a dog." I stopped imagining kids after a while. I think I thought I'd missed the window. He reached for her hand and gave it a soft squeeze. "You didn't." She looked down. The ring on her finger caught the light, simple, elegant, with a small sapphire Eli had chosen because it looked like the sky. "I didn't think I'd ever feel new again," she whispered. Ben sat up, brushing a leaf from her shoulder. "You're not new. You're exactly who you were always meant to be." They watched Eli run in loops until he flopped on the grass a few feet away, panting with dramatic flair. Ben leaned in, his voice quiet. "I want all of it with you, the life you didn't get to have before. The kids, the quiet nights, the burnt toast and messy mornings. I want to give you all of it." Julia's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "You already have." He kissed her, soft and sure, beneath the whispering branches. The same park Rachel had once loved. It didn't feel like replacing a memory. It felt like letting it go, gently, and choosing something new in its place. Eli rolled onto his back and groaned, "Ooh, grown-ups kissing!" Julia laughed and threw a crumpled napkin at him. Ben pulled her close and smiled against her temple. Grief had taken everything. But love had returned what mattered most. And all that remained was enough. Original, heartwarming fiction every week. Subscribe for your next great story.